Hey guys, so I'm going to do a short review on the Sig P229 Equinox. Sig P229 is available in either 357 Sig or 40 Smith & Wesson. They're very similar cartridges. The P229, all the P229X series pistols are very similar in design. They're very well known for being incredibly accurate, durable, reliable, finely crafted, well-built handguns. There's a lot of law enforcement agencies that use the P229X series pistols. A lot of specialty law enforcement use these types of firearms, and for good reason. They're finely crafted handguns. Now, in my opinion, the P229 Equinox is the nicest looking of all the P229 variants, and I also think that the P229 is the most attractive, best looking, best feeling, best shooting of all of the P229X type pistols. So I'm going to talk about them today. I'm going to compare them with another fine Sig product at a similar price point, the Sig 1911F Nightmare. It's a 1911 45 ACP standard type of gun, but the fit is excellent. Many things about this 1911 are excellent and put it into a class shared by some very well-known names in 1911 making. So we'll compare these in a bit, but first I want to talk about our P229 Equinox. Now, I've wanted one of these for a long time. I think the finish, you probably can't see it very easily. Maybe you can as I tilt it in the light. The slide itself is black, probably parkerized or some other kind of coating. But then the sides of the slide have been milled a bit to bring out the brushed stainless steel highlights on the grip cuts, the slide cuts here, and then along the slide on this piece. The Equinox is a moderately heavy handgun. It's heavier than, say, a Glock 19, which is similar sized. In fact, I'll get it out for you to compare. So this is a handgun that a lot of people are familiar with. This is a Gen 1 Glock 19. Some minor modifications. This one came with night sights, so in a way it's very comparable to the P229. You can see size-wise, they're pretty similar. You can overlay them. Grip height, let's see if I can match up about where the sights are. The P229 has a longer grip by just a hair. It looks longer because I've got a magazine in the P229, whereas I don't have one in the Glock 19. If you match up the rear of the gun, the front, the length of the slide is about the same in both handguns. Lay them back to back. You can tell the P229 is a much thicker handgun by almost 50%, and it feels much thicker. But otherwise, dimensionally, they're very similar. Now, the Glock 19 is also known for being very accurate, very reliable, very durable, etc. And it is far cheaper than the P229. And if I had to choose one to conceal carry or to have to use, I would probably choose the Glock 19 in 9mm. But that's not part of this discussion. Weight-wise, I should have pointed out, if I take out the magazine, there you go. Weight-wise, they actually feel kind of the same. The slide on the Glock 19 is pretty heavy. The whole frame on the P229 is pretty heavy. I have a scale. If I were to weigh these two, I get 1.86 6 pounds for the P229 without a magazine. And I have 1.33 pounds for the Glock 19 with no magazine. And I guess that's fair. They do feel similar in weight, at least at the slide. Now the grips are clearly different. I mean, the Glock 19, the whole frame is very light, whereas the slide part of the Glock 19 is much heavier. But the grips, especially on the Equinox model, the grips are wood laminate. They're gray wood laminate, but they are very thick. In fact, they're the thickest handgun grips I think I've ever felt on a handgun before. 1.45 inches compared to the Glock 19's 1.16 inches. So there's a 0.3 inch difference, which doesn't sound like a lot on its own, but when you look at them side to side, it is quite a lot different. Now, the trigger on the P229 from the factory, to be frank, it's not great. The trigger, single action trigger pull, is very heavy. And that's kind of to be expected. It's part of the design. There is no external safety other than the trigger. Double action trigger pull has got a fair bit of creep, fair bit of take up before you get to the trigger itself. And from there, it's still got a little bit of creep. It's a little creep back. There it went. 5 pounds. 5 pounds, if you're not familiar with trigger pull weights, is about the same as a Remington 700. A factory Remington 700 trigger is about 5 pounds or so. An AR trigger is in the ballpark of usually 6.5 to 7 or 8 pounds. So definitely lighter than those two things, but still pretty heavy. Now, that being said, unlike the Glock, even though there is a bit of creep in the trigger, unlike the Glock always has a moderately creepy trigger and kind of feels springy when you get up to the. It's very springy. You really can't tell when it's gonna. Let go. Springy, boink. So very different. In comparison, again, the 1911 single action trigger, always single action trigger. Squeeze. Got a little bit of take up, a little bit of creep, but then brakes pretty light. You know, it's much feels much lighter, probably because there's very little movement. But that being said, those numbers were measured with a few modifications. One of the things I did with this gun was I installed a short reset trigger. So if I were to fire and then the slide were to back as it would under normal firing, the reset is now click, ready to shoot again. Click. Whereas the stock P229 reset was almost all the way out. It's much further out. Doesn't change things a whole lot, but it does make kind of a difference when you're trying to shoot it accurately. In addition, I also installed a lighter hammer spring. It came with a very heavy, I think, an 18-pound hammer spring. I installed a 14-pound hammer spring. Or maybe it came with a 21-pound and I installed an 18-pound. I don't remember, but I did lighten it up by 3 or 4 pounds. And that did change the double action trigger pull good bit. It definitely feels lighter, and it's just as reliable, at least with the ammo that I was shooting. So that's enough about the feel. That's what it is dimensionally, what it feels like to pull the trigger, its controls, those types of things. It's got a decocker like all P series, P22X series pistols. as far as I know. Accuracy-wise, performance-wise, I will say right off the bat, this 1911 is one of the most accurate firearms I own in terms of handguns. The Dan Wessons definitely give it a run for its money, but I have never felt like I could shoot better than this 1911 can shoot. Even with my bad habits, even if I flinch a tiny bit, it still will put bullets on target pretty much in the same place. Partly because of how it fits in my hands, partly because of its size, partly because of how the trigger works. It's very hard to pull the gun off target when you're pulling the trigger. So if you look, this group here was shot at 10 yards. This is a 15, both of these are the same, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So both of these are 15 round groups at 10 yards. You can see pretty much one hole here, one big hole. And there's a few outliers as I was flinching, and this is at the end of shooting, so I was a little bit worn out. Here is my second group of the day. I don't want to show you my first group of the day because it was pretty embarrassing. But here's my second group of the day with the P229 after I got adjusted to it. Now, the trigger, one of the reasons why I played with the trigger so much is that because there's such a long take up, and really the single actions, this double action trigger is not so bad, but with the single action trigger, because the gun is so fat, and because the point where the trigger breaks is so far back in the trigger guard, I had a tendency to catch my knuckle here on top of the trigger, and when I would squeeze the trigger in of that kind of heavy trigger pull, I would pull the gun up and to the left a bit, just from that trigger squeeze. I just pull just a little bit, and that little bitty bit would shift my point of aim, the place where I was aiming, from here up to about here. And it made for some very large, ugly groups as I was trying to compensate for where the bullets were impacting. Not ideal. Now, I have since learned, with this gun in particular, that I really have to be careful to catch the trigger on the pad and then detach the rest of my hand from the tip of my finger when I pull back. Make sure to pull back exactly straight, and when I did that, my groups tightened up. Now, this still looks like a wider spread than the 1911, and it is to some extent. You also have to compare the 1911 is shooting much larger bullets, and so it's much easier to stitch a big hole out of big bullets than it is to stitch a big hole out of smaller bullets. But in general, definitely my groups were tighter with the 1911 than they were with my P229. However, I believe this gun is absolutely every bit as accurate as this 1911 is. I was shooting this later, and while I was still more accurate with the 1911, I know I've seen my father shoot one, and I definitely shot some and had bullets impact right where I wanted them to, so I'm absolutely confident this gun is accurate. It's just a matter of me learning to control it. As far as the cartridge, I don't know how familiar with you are, and I should also mention, even though I don't have a group with the Glock 19, I can generally shoot groups a lot like this 1911 with my Glock 19, and typically shoot groups like this 1911 with my Dan Wesson 44 Magnums as well, but that's through a lot of practice with these firearms. Cartridge-wise, you're probably pretty familiar with the 9mm, pretty light recoiling round, very small round, high capacity. The recoil is not too snappy because the bullets are so light, even in a gun this size, which has a very light frame. The 1911 45 ACP has got much more recoil, but because the bullet's slower, it doesn't feel snappy. It feels like your hand is being pushed backwards and pushed up, but there's no real pain in it. It's just a matter of psychologically overcoming that push into your hands. Very controllable. Now, I think the 40 Smith & Wesson is the kind of mix. I mean, it's obviously a mix, but it's kind of got the worst of both worlds as well. The 40 Smith & Wesson recoil isn't so extreme, especially with a heavier handgun like this P229, but because the 40 Smith & Wesson bullet is so fast, and because the bullet weights are heavier, it feels very snappy. There is definitely, even though the recoil, the amount of force being pushed into your hand is less, you can definitely feel a sting or just a sharpness to the recoil. You can definitely feel it. And I'm not convinced that translates too much to terminal effectiveness. The terminal ballistics probably aren't all that different. But just be aware of that if you're going to choose a gun in 40 Smith & Wesson. This P229 is not the only gun that I've felt suffered from the same kind of recoil. I have shot one of my friend's USPs, maybe not the USP, it's whatever H&K's USP, similar, polymer framed steel slide 40 Smith & Wesson. Felt very similar to this P229 and shot about the same in my hands too, which is strange. The cost of the ammo, right between 9mm and 45 ACP. It's more expensive than 9mm, cheaper than 45 ACP. That's all there really is to say about that. Reliability wise, I've ran about 200 rounds through it, so I haven't put a whole lot, but typically the first couple hundred rounds are when you're going to see the most reliability issues up front as the gun breaks in. I've not had a single failure to feed or failure to eject with this handgun. It's been absolutely reliable so far. Maintenance wise, it's been said about the Sig P229 series handguns that they like to be ran wet. What that means is oil everywhere. This handgun came shipped from the factory with grease on the inside of the hammer, between the hammer and the frame, and also grease on the slide rails. Now, I didn't have whatever white grease that they were using, so when I did my first clean, I cleaned all of it off and I replaced it with some moly grease. So that's what this gun is using. You can see there's a little bit of grease left over. But grease on the rails on the frame, I put a little bit of grease on the rails on the slide. Everything else that moves or could move has oil on it. Let me just stick my finger in here and do something risky. I want to feel that feed ramp. Feed ramp, when I tried to clean the feed ramp up, it had some copper on it for sure. And I never really got it cleaned off. And it's spooky because, that copper, even though you can tell it's copper, it at least looks like rust. And I know it's not rust. And it's definitely not rust because the barrel is stainless steel. But, and I'm not sure what the frame is made out of. The frame might be aluminum. I'm not 100% sure. But it just looks weird. So, that's what you get. Gorgeous gun, accurate gun, reliable gun, and, well, before we get to the last bit of this video, the other two features I should point out, besides the gorgeous grips in the frame, silver highlighted hammer and trigger and takedown pin, and gorgeous black slide with stainless highlighted 6-hour logo, Equinox logo, and slide cut. Maybe you've been able to see it pretty cleanly. Very nice looking gun, absolutely gorgeous gun. Stainless steel screws to go with the grips, very well put together. Also, Equinox. So all of my guns have night sights. The 1911 F Nightmare, similar color patterns, has tritium night sights on the back, tritium night sight on the front. My Glock 19, tritium night sights on the back, tritium night sight on the front. Which probably need to be replaced. They're probably getting pretty dim by now. Equinox has tritium night sights on the back and a fiber optic sight on the front. going with the theme of Equinox, equally good in the dark and in the daytime. Pretty clever design. Shooting it outside, the fiber optic sight is very bright, so it makes it very easy to put a dot on target. The tritium sights in the dark are sufficiently bright. I'm not too convinced that I will be able to see the holographic sight in the dark because it requires external light to light up the fiber optic. That being said, I don't intend to be shooting it at night. It's certainly not in a dark house. I have other guns for that are better suited for the job of home defense, etc. So the last thing I want to talk about is price. Now, the P229X series pistols are not cheap. I've seen them as in typically the $800 ballpark for a basic one. That's kind of to be expected from most SIG pistols. Most SIG pistols are not cheap. This 1911F Nightmare was list priced around $1,100. I bought it several years ago from a gun show for $950 before tax and etc. This P229 Equinox was listed at $1,250, so quite a lot of money for a handgun. I ended up paying $975, no, $1,037, so $1,037 out the door, taxes, fees, everything. Again, I'll emphasize, it is a lot of money. That would almost buy you 2 Glock 19s. And I'm convinced that these Glock 19s or the 40 cal version will perform very similarly. But Glock 19, workhorse, great handgun, not really all that attractive, not really all that special. Everybody's got one. It's cool, but it's cool in a utilitarian way. The P229 is cool in an exotic and in a luxury way. And I think it is worth spending the extra money on over a normal P229. I think the P229 is worth having. If you don't have a SIG P229X series pistol, I would recommend the P229 or the P226. They're both really fine firearms. If you don't have a nice handgun, I would recommend you get a SIG P229X series handgun. I recommend the P229X series handguns along with the Beretta M9. I mean, the Glock makes nice handguns, and there's a few others out there. But definitely keep your eye, definitely consider getting one. And if you're going to get one, don't get the Equinox because it's one I have, but definitely get one of their other special editions or special appearance upgrades. So that's all I have. I'm going to include or have included some live fire shooting at steel plates so you can see the kind of knockdown power it has, the kind of accuracy it has, and you can see my bad shooting. So thanks, like, subscribe. Any kind of encouragement is greatly helpful. It takes a lot of energy, it takes a lot of work to put out videos, and it can be pretty discouraging at times when you put something out and it's only got a few views. So definitely, please help me do my part by doing your part in supporting the channel. Thanks again, and goodbye.